called Life Swap. And what we've been doing is we've been examining certain things in our lives, different aspects of our lives that we could perhaps do without, things that we might want to get rid of, things that can get in the way of our relationship with God and in the way of right relationship with each other. And since it can be troublesome and difficult to root out a sin or a bad habit like that on its own, we've also been looking at what we might replace those things with in our lives, hence the swap. So before I jump into what I say this morning, I'll just mention that if you missed Joel's sermon last week, I encourage you to go to the website and check that out. A lot of what he said will be directly applicable to what I'm saying this morning. And I also want to say, before I get into it, that I might be a little bit hard on all of us this morning. And if I am, please know that this message is as much for me as it is for anybody else. But the reason that I say that I might be hard on us is because as we continue the series, this morning I want to look at what C.S. Lewis describes as the one vice of which no person in the world is free, which everyone in the world loathes when they see it in someone else, and of which hardly any people ever imagine that they are guilty themselves. There is no fault which makes a person more unpopular, and no fault which we are more unconscious of in ourselves. And the more we have it ourselves, the more we dislike it in others. Now, this vice that I'm talking about is pride, or self-conceit. And before I get too far in, I want to account for some possible misunderstandings about pride. A couple of things that pride is not, perhaps. Because we say in the English language that a person is proud of their daughter or their father, or perhaps proud of their school or their country. And you might ask, well, is pride in this sense harmful? Is it sinful or harmful to us? And I think that depends on exactly what we might be proud of. Because often when we say that we're proud of something or someone, what we really mean is that we have a warm admiration for that person or that thing. And certainly admiring something is not harmful. And there's nothing wrong with that. But it can be problematic if we start giving ourselves an air of importance because of our association with that person or that thing. A second thing is that taking pleasure in being praised by others is also not necessarily pride. When a parent pats you on the back for doing well in school, or when your spouse tells you that you are beautiful, there's nothing wrong with feeling good about that. Because you're taking pleasure in the fact that you have pleased someone who you rightly wanted to please. There's nothing wrong with that. The trouble can begin when we go from thinking, I have pleased them, all is well, to instead thinking, I must be a really great person to have done it. The more we delight in ourselves, and the less we delight in the pleasure of others, the more we dip into pride, and the worse pride can become. Now, as I mentioned C.S. Lewis, but according to many other historical Christian teachers, the essential vice or sin, the utmost evil is pride. Sexual immorality, anger, greed, drunkenness, all of that stuff is nothing in comparison to pride, because it was through pride that the serpent led Adam and Eve to eat the fruit in Eden. Pride leads us to every other kind of evil. It is the complete anti-God state of mind. Now, it might seem to some people that I'm exaggerating that a little bit to make a point, but let's think about it. Because, most of us might not admit that we are prideful. We might admit to lots of other things, maybe some of those other sins that I mentioned or things that we do wrong, but very few of us often sit back and think, wow, I'm a really prideful person. So how can pride be the root of all those other things? But if we think about it, as I pointed out earlier, the more pride a person has, the more one dislikes pride in others. In fact, if you want to find out how proud you are, the easiest way is to ask yourself, how much do I like it or dislike it when other people snub me or ignore me? How much do I dislike it when people refuse to take notice of me or patronize me or show off? Most of us don't like that. And that's because each of our pride is in competition with everyone else's pride. It's because I secretly wanted to be the center of attention at the party that I am annoyed that somebody else is instead. And I think that pride in that way is essentially competitive. Because when we say that a person is proud of being rich or educated or good-looking, what we really mean is that they are proud of being richer or more educated or better looking than someone else. That comparison between yourself and the other is what makes you proud. That feeling of superiority over another. And in that way, that comparison to others, pride always means enmity or discord. And not only discord between us, but between us and God as well. Because in God, we come up against something, someone, which is in every aspect immeasurably more powerful and superior to ourselves. And unless we acknowledge God as that, unless we know God as all-powerful and immeasurably more so than ourselves, we can't know God. So as long as we are proud, we can't know him. A proud person is always looking down on things and people. And of course, as long as you're looking down, you can't look up to God. And so that raises a pretty interesting question. If all of us, in some sense, encounter pride and have it in our lives, how is it that people who are so full of pride to the extreme can say that they believe in God and appear to be very religious people if it's such an anti-God thing? And I'm afraid that that happens quite often, actually, because there's this hard truth that sometimes, instead of thinking about our relationship with God as something to look up to God for, we pay a little bit of humility to God. We acknowledge God as greater than ourselves in a small way, and then we turn that as a way of making us feel better than everyone else who does not do that. And unfortunately, we see that all too often. And I suppose it may be that sort of attitude that Jesus was talking about or thinking about when he said that some would preach about him and cast out devils in his name, only to be told at the end of the world that he never knew them. And any of us can fall into that trap. But luckily, we have a test. And it's pretty simple. Whenever we find that our religious life is making us feel that we are good, or that above all, we are better than someone else, that's pride. And the real test of being in the presence of God is that you either forget about yourself entirely, or you see yourself as a very small part of a much bigger picture. And it's a terrible thing that this, most evil of all vices can smuggle itself into the very center of our religious lives. But you can see how it happens, and it can happen without us being aware of it. Now, we read in 1 Peter this morning, just to further emphasize the point, that God opposes the proud. And I want to be clear that we must not think that pride is something God forbids because he is offended at it, or because he thinks that humility is something that he demands because of his own dignity, as if God himself were proud and wants none of us to be. God is not worried about his dignity. But instead, God wants to delight in us in our humility. The point is that he wants us to know him. And he doesn't want us to worry about our superiority over anything else. He and us are two things that really, if we're to get in touch with God, in reality, we have to be humble. It's impossible not to be. God is so great and so omnipotent and so beyond that God opposes the proud because a proud person can't possibly come to know him and have a relationship with him. God is trying to make us humble in order to make those moments of realization, those moments of listening, those moments of understanding, in order to make those possible. Those aren't possible with an attitude of pride. And I wish that I personally have gotten a little farther on this journey of humility, because then I might be able to tell you, exactly what it feels like to live a fully humble life and what it feels like to be totally humble in those moments and forget yourself and just accept God's greatness and his wisdom into my life. But the reality is that I all too often am not humble. So what does it even look like? What does it even look like to replace this pride, this thing that can get so in the way of our relationship with God? What does it look like to get rid of that and replace it with its opposite, with humility, with a humble attitude towards God? And I think sometimes if we, try to imagine a humble person, we might imagine someone who, dresses poorly and doesn't really, care about themselves or their physical appearance or the way they look or how they appear to other people. And the truth is that, humility isn't necessarily self-deprecation. It's not necessarily that at all. I think more likely what we're to encounter when we encounter someone who is truly humble is that we encounter someone who seems cheerful and intelligent and like they had absolutely every interest in whatever it was that we had to say to them. Because if we dislike this person, it will be because we're so jealous that they seem to enjoy life so easily. I think that that's really what a humble person will look like. It's not someone who is thinking about their own humility. It's someone who is totally focused on the other person. They will not be thinking about themselves at all. And that can be difficult because we are ourselves. So, of course, we're always on our mind in a sense. So how do we acquire that sort of humility that is other-focused? And I think really simply, and perhaps the most difficult step, is to first think and acknowledge that I myself am prideful. It's a big step. But without acknowledging it, there's nothing else that I can do. If I don't acknowledge that I am at times conceited and full of pride and see myself as better than others or as if I should be the focus of God's or someone else's attention, if I can't acknowledge that I seek that, then I won't be able to get rid of it. It's pretty simple. And if you think that you're not conceited, it's probably a sign, believe it or not, that you are, in fact, conceited. It's just one of those things. It's kind of the way it works. And so, for an example to kind of get further into how we move towards humility and away from this debilitating pride, I want to turn again to the passage that we read this morning. And I'm just going to read it again for us as a reminder. So 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 1 to 7. If you have a Bible in front of you or you want to look it up on your phone, please go ahead and join me. To the elders among you, I appeal as a fellow elder and a witness of Christ's sufferings, who also will share in the glory to be revealed. Be shepherds of God's flock that is under your care, watching over them. Not because you must, but because you are willing, as God wants you to be. Not pursuing dishonest gain, but eager to serve. Not lording it over those entrusted to you, but being examples to the flock. And when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the crown of glory that will never fade away. In the same way, you who are younger, submit yourselves to your elders, and all of you clothe yourself with humility toward one another, because God opposes the proud, but shows favor to the humble. Humble yourselves, therefore, under God's mighty hand, that he may lift you up in due time. Cast all your anxiety on him, because he cares for you. And I think what we have here in Peter's letter is a description of how to be a humble shepherd. And one of the first things that he mentions is that we should watch over those under our care. Not because we must, not out of obligation, but because we are willing. Now, many, if not all of us, in some way, shape, or form, or in some place in our lives, will find ourselves in a position of power or some small authority over another person, whether that's at work or at home or at school, wherever that might be. An older child and a younger child at school, there are all kinds of different positions, and each of us at some point will find ourselves in a situation like that. And I think it's important for us when we are in those types of situations, those positions of authority, to see ourselves as a willing servant, not as an obligation to take care of something that might be an annoyance to us, but we must be willing to watch over those under our care. And Peter makes another point immediately after. He says, don't use these situations in which you have authority for your own gain, but instead be eager to serve. And I think Christ is the ultimate example of that. When we're in a position of authority, it behooves us to serve those whom we have authority over and see ourselves as lesser, or put them above ourselves as opposed to the other way around, and not exploit our position for our own gain. Peter also says, do not lord anything over them. Do not lord anything over those who have less, but instead be a godly example. Now, I can say this with confidence. All of us in this room have more than someone else in the world, and probably more than someone else we have encountered in our personal lives. And so when that happens, we must not lord what we have over those who have not, but instead be a godly example, which it turns out is a humble example, as the example of Christ. And lastly, he says this, and those who are younger, submit yourselves to your elders. And to extrapolate on that a little bit, I know there are probably some parents, wanting their kids to really pay attention to that part of the passage right now. But to extrapolate a little bit on that, we also find ourselves in positions where others have authority over us. And I think what Peter is trying to tell us is when we find ourselves in those situations, it's also important for us not to try and take the authority for ourselves. And I think I mentioned earlier the Garden of Eden and the serpent using pride to convince Adam and Eve to eat of the fruit. And really, I think that's kind of the same thing as what Peter is saying here. Don't do that. Don't think of yourself as superior than that person who has given you instruction or told you what to do. Certainly not in the case of God. Of course, we may differ in opinions from those who have authority over us. I'm not saying, we can't do that. But we must not see ourselves as better than them because they've, done something that we disagree with or given us a task that we don't enjoy. And just to kind of get maybe more of a practical look at this, I want to look at some specific examples of people, of what it might look like to live humbly, to kind of cast our self-absorption and our pride aside in favor of humility. Now, when I was in school, I read the book To Kill a Mockingbird. I know many of you will have read this book as well. It's been around for quite some time. And the main character is a man by the name of Atticus Finch. So he's a lawyer and a father who defends a young black man of rape in 1932. And so in that day, as you can imagine, his decision to defend this man was not popular. He's called all kinds of names, and even his children on occasion bear the brunt of his decision to defend this black man, Tom Robinson. And an all-white jury eventually convicts Tom of the crime, even though they do it purely because it's a white man accusing a black man. And Atticus tells Tom that they will appeal the decision. And so now Atticus is telling Tom's family about this bad news of the decision. And the white man who framed Tom Robinson watches Atticus interacting with Tom's family. And then he begins to utter contempt to Atticus, and he demeans him. He says degrading things to Atticus. He even spits on Atticus. And Atticus's response is very interesting. And it's probably what I, in that situation, would not have done. So this white man, Bob Ewell is his name, spits in Atticus's face, and he berates him verbally, even challenges him to a fight. And Atticus does nothing. He simply wipes the spit off his face, and he begins walking away. Bob Ewell then continues to accuse Atticus, ironically, of being too proud to fight. And Atticus responds that, no, I'm just too old to fight. So now, Jem and Scout, Atticus's children, they later, because they witnessed this encounter, they ask Atticus why he didn't fight back. And Atticus gives us a couple of reasons for why he acted the way he did, just turning and walking away. He said, and one reason that he gave is that Bob needed to vent his frustrations because he had just been embarrassed in court by Atticus. And Atticus figured that by accepting this humiliation from him, he was in a way helping Bob out. He said, Jem, to his child, see if you can stand in Bob Ewell's shoes a minute. I destroyed his last shred of credibility in that appeal trial. If he had any to begin with, he had to have some kind of comeback. Now, a more powerful reason that Atticus goes on to give for his actions is that he was concerned for Bob's daughter, Mayella. Atticus says, so if spitting in my face and threatening me saves Mayella one extra beating, that is something I'll gladly take. Because Atticus knew that Bob had beat his daughter in the past. So he says, Bob had to take it out on somebody, and I'd rather it be me than that house full of children he has at home. So Atticus's response is ultimately humble because his focus is on others and not on himself. He asks, when he's giving his reason for his children, to step into Bob's shoes for a minute. Imagine his situation. Atticus has just been, humiliated and spat on and called a coward in front of everyone. But he accepted that, knowing that there were more important things going on. And the best thing he could do in that situation was to humbly walk away. Now, the Apostle Paul writes of Christ in Philippians that we should do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others as more significant than yourselves. Let each of you look not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others. And that is what Atticus was doing in that situation. But I think really if we're looking for an example of casting pride aside and an example of humility, we have to, of course, look to Christ. Because there is no greater example of humility in the Bible or anywhere else than you will find in the person of Jesus Christ. Now, I don't know about you, but I am really glad that Jesus didn't look to his own interests in the final days of his life. Before he was given over to be crucified, he prayed 3 times in the garden to have the burden lifted from him, to have it removed. But instead of, removing it himself, he knowingly and lovingly would go on to allow the worst to happen to him so that it wouldn't have to happen to us. And so, Paul writes again in Philippians, "Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus. Though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men." What if Christ had said, "No one else who's innocent is being crucified? Why do I have to die? I didn't do anything." But instead, being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, and even death on a cross. Jesus was so other-focused. He loved us so much that he died on a cross for us. He gave us an example, as Peter was asking us to do. He was an example of humility to all of us. And I think the best thing that we can do is seek to follow that example wherever we can. Jesus endured much shame, ridicule, scorn, torture, humiliation. And I would venture to say that if we truly take on a mantle of humility, we will often face those same adversities. And Jesus even faced agonizing death on a cross. And what greater humility is there than that? Now, I'm hopeful that none of us will have to face that inevitable end because of our humility. But the reality is that sometimes we can face adversity when we put others before ourselves. And we live, of course, in a world and a culture that does not often do that. More often, we put ourselves first, and it can be very hard to work against that. But we see the results in the lives of others. We see the results in all of our lives here this morning because of what Jesus did in humility. And I think that what we can do is to first acknowledge the pride that we have in ourselves. Acknowledge those situations when we are annoyed because someone else is the center of attention, or when we go to God and ask things only for ourselves and instead of acknowledging others and the superiority of God before us. And secondly, we can read passages like this in 1 Peter and see descriptions of how we can continue to work that out in our lives. Seek the instructions of God to live a humble life and ultimately follow the example of Christ Jesus. So if you will, I'll ask that you again join me in prayer this morning.